Everyone to Daf Yomi, 1 week at a time. We are starting Masechet Chagiga. So happy to have everyone with us today. Before we start, there's something Web Yeshiva wanted me to announce that they are having a program you can order mishloach manot and send it to any friends or family here in Israel, actually. And I'm going to add over here in the chat box a link if you want to send mishloach manot to friends, family, teachers here in Israel. And it's a way to support Web Yeshiva. I think that there's a way when you put in a certain code, some of the proceeds go towards Web Yeshiva to help them in terms of their free courses and things like that. So also it's exciting. Today's actually Purim Katan, meaning today's Adar Aleph. If today wouldn't have been a leap year, it would have been Purim. But since today, and those of you who have learned Masechet Megillah know that when there's a leap year, we actually celebrate Purim in Adar Bet. But today is what's called Purim Katan, which is a minor Purim, and just wishing everyone a happy Purim Katan. Okay, let's talk about Masechet Chagiga.
Rabbi,
yes.
You are making the assumption that if I wanted to do that, my technology is so under. I can't send money. I can't do anything. So talk to your boss and tell him to have an alternative way.
I'm not sure. Feel free, Lizette, feel free to email me and I'll see if we can figure something out. I'm happy to help you. Excellent. Thank you so much. So today is our first class for Masechet Chagiga. We are going to be reviewing Daf 2 till 6. Again, if anybody is new to learning the Talmud, you should know that the Daf starts, right? The first page is actually Daf Bet, meaning page 2. There are many explanations as to why that is. Some say it's because it's as if there's no beginning and no end. It's as if you already started, so you're already on page 2. Another explanation, somebody said beautifully, is that page 1 is what's called derech eretz. Right? First, we are kind to others, and that's page 1. Page 2 is, what's written in the Talmud. So that's I think a beautiful idea. It says in Ethics of Our Fathers in Pirkei Avot, right? Derech Eretz Kadma LeTorah. First, we are upright citizens. We take care of each other, and then we learn Torah. So that is something that one can see if you say that is where page 1 is. Just an introduction to Masechet Chagiga. You can see on this slide that was beautifully made by Web Yeshiva. You can see a picture of the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, and the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. Masechet Chagiga speaks about the mitzvah, that's called Aliya L'Regel, which literally means to go up on the festival, on the regel, on the festival. There is a commandment we're going to see in the first Mishna that every man is commanded to go up to Jerusalem, to the temple, 3 times a year. And when you go up to the temple, you should not come empty-handed. And our Gemara is going to discuss the different sacrifices that one brings when going to the temple on those 3 times a year on the festivals. So just to give you an overview, and then we'll read the Mishnah in the Gemara, but there are 3 sacrifices that we are going to be discussing. The first one is called Olat Hariyah, which really means Olah is the burnt offering. Riyah literally means to see. And therefore, the Mishnah is going to explain that when we go to see the temple, we bring this sacrifice, right? It's literally the burnt offering of seeing, right? Of seeing the temple. And again, a burnt offering and an olah is a sacrifice that is completely burnt, meaning the entire animal is sacrificed. Nobody eats from it. It is all for God. That's an olah, a burnt offering. The other korban that we're going to discuss is called Shlamei Chagiga. A shlamim is here it says in English, a peace offering, but the idea is it's a sacrifice that some of the parts of the animal go on the altar, meaning for God. Some go to the Kohanim, the priests, and a lot of the meat goes to the person who brought the offering. And this is a way of having meat on the festival. And it's interesting that we think about having meat nowadays as part of our festival. This was a way to bring it as a sacrifice, meaning you bring part of the animal for God and you share it, right? Basically, we're sharing, right? Part goes to God, to the priest, and to the person who brings the animal as well. And it's called Shlamei Chagiga, again, because it's a chag, it's a holiday, a festival. And this was part of the festival meal. And this sacrifice is what gives the Masechet its name, right? Masechet Chagiga is because of this sacrifice, the Shlamei Chagiga. The third sacrifice is called Shlamei Simcha. And this is also a shlamim, right? A peace offering. Again, this idea that you're also eating from it. And it brings simcha, right? It brings happiness or joy to the people eating it. Again, this was brought so that the family or whoever's coming up to Jerusalem will have meat to eat during the festival. So those are the three sacrifices, and we're going to talk more about them as we progress in our Masechet. So let's go to Daf 2. The Mishnah begins, or the Gemara, the entire Masechet begins. The first Mishnah tells us that everyone needs to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year. And now we're going to have, right, again, in beautiful Talmudic fashion, we're going to have a general statement, right? Everybody needs to go, except. And now we're going to go through the exceptions. Who does not need to go to Jerusalem? Again, I remind you, these are the days before public transportation, cars, trains, right? Anybody who is going to need to travel either a short or a great distance, and it's not easy, right? So anybody, basically, we're going to see that anybody with a difficulty to travel will likely not go to Jerusalem. So here we go. The Mishnah tells us who does not have to go. A cheresh. Cheresh means a deaf mute, meaning someone who cannot hear and cannot speak. We're going to talk more about this in the Gemara. A shoteh, somebody who is insane, right, not in their right mind. And a katan, a minor. These three people are generally categorized together. This is one category. And the way we define this category is people who do not have, I guess what we'll say, in Hebrew we say da'at, right? So that means intellect, knowledge, right? They don't have the mental capacity like a regular adult. So cheresh, shoteh, v'katan, again, the deaf mute, the person who's insane, and the minor, they do not have enough, intellect or understanding in order to fulfill this mitzvah, and therefore they do not have to go. Next is another group, which is tumtum and androgynous. This is androgynous and hermaphrodite, meaning two people who, right, people with non-specific gender, right, either having both genders or or neither, right, non-differentiated sexual organs, and therefore, and we'll see that the Torah tells us that every male needs to go up, and since these two types of people are not necessarily male, therefore they are exempt. We'll talk more about it in the Mishnah, in the Gemara. Women and slaves, they are right, also are not obligated. This is a different category. This category, right, women and slaves, that category is really about not having your own time, right? Again, women are definitely in the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara are taking care of the home, taking care of the children, taking care of their husbands. They don't necessarily have enough time to take off a week to go to Jerusalem, and therefore they are exempt. Next, the Mishnah continues, someone who is lame, meaning they physically cannot walk to Jerusalem. Someone who is blind, again, the Gemara is going to discuss why each one of these people is exempt. Someone who is sick, someone who is old, and again, someone who physically cannot walk up to Jerusalem. The Gemara asks, what does it mean, a minor? Right? Again, normally we think of a minor as below 12 or 13, based on, right, either boy or a girl. Here it seems it's much younger, and it says that either it's a child who can't sit on their father's shoulder, or it's a child who can't hold their father's hand and walk up. But if they are old enough to sit on their father's shoulder or walk while holding hands, then you should bring your child up to Jerusalem. And then at the end of the Mishnah, discusses a machloket between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai on how much you need to spend on each sacrifice. Here we're going to focus on the first two that I mentioned, the Olat Re'iyah and the Chagigah. So Beit Shammai says you need to spend more money on the Olat Re'iyah, on the burnt offering, as opposed to the Chagigah, the one that has to do with, right, us eating meat. Beit Hillel say, no, the opposite. You spend more on the Chagigah and less on the Re'iyah. And we'll discuss this in the Gemara, why that is. Okay, the Gemara tells us, we mentioned that slaves are not obligated to go up, but the Gemara tells us that someone who is half slave, half free, is obligated. And of course, the Gemara describes how that's possible. How do you have someone who is half a slave? The Gemara describes it's a person who was owned by two people. One of them freed him and the other didn't. We'll see in a minute that is a very complicated case, because the person is, there's no such thing as half, so they become basically neither a slave nor free, and that becomes very complicated. We'll see what happens with him in a minute. Or the Gemara says that maybe the Mishnah is also coming to include someone who who basically couldn't go up on the first day, but got better and could go up on the second day. And we'll see later on in the Masechet, we're going to discuss, I didn't mention it in the introduction, but the assumption is that these sacrifices are brought on the first day. But we know that, let's say, Pesach and Sukkot are 7-day holidays or 8-day holidays. So the question is, so the Gemara is going to tell us that if you don't bring it on the first day, you can bring it any day of the holiday. And the question is it because every day there's an obligation till you fulfill it, or there's only an obligation on the first day, and if you didn't bring it, so then you can make it up. The nafkamina, right, the practical application of these two opinions is, if there's only an obligation on the first day, if you yourself were not obligated on that first day, then you don't need to make it up day 2, 3, or 4. But if every day there is an obligation, then as soon as you get better on day 2, you need to bring this sacrifice. We'll see this later on in the Masechet, but here the Gemara talks about it a little bit in terms of are the rest of the days makeup days, or there's an obligation every day till you bring this sacrifice. The Gemara here also discusses if you're blind in one eye, maybe you're obligated to bring the this korban and you have to come to Jerusalem. Others say no. Person needs to be seeing in both eyes. And it's a beautiful idea because we have this idea of ri'iyah. We need to see, right? We're going to the temple to see. The Gemara says we're also being seen, right? God sees us coming to Jerusalem. And the Gemara says, just like God sees us with two eyes, even though, again, anthropomorphically, not really, but right, God sees us completely. We need to see completely, and therefore we need to see with both eyes. And therefore, if somebody is blind in one eye, they are not obligated to go to Jerusalem. The Gemara now discusses the cheresh, right? What is this deaf mute? Again, as I mentioned, it's someone who doesn't have da'at, again, meaning intellect, someone who, and here the Gemara explains that the cheresh is someone who can't hear and can't speak, because if you can do one of those things, then you recognize that that person does understand, right? If they can hear, but they can't necessarily verbalize what they're hearing, you know that they're hearing, they're acquiring information, or vice versa, right? If they're deaf but they can speak, they can communicate. So the Gemara seems to say that if it's only one or the other, they are obligated because they do have intellect, they do understand. Again, we have to remember we're talking about a time, I would imagine there's no sign language, right? There's no hearing aid or cochlear implants, right? There isn't a system that is helping these people to communicate. So it's interesting that the Gemara seems to be sensitive that if you are only, right, deaf but can speak, or you're mute but you can hear, it seems that the Gemara does understand that you do have intellect and you can understand things. Okay, it seems that, the Gemara tells us on Daf 3 that the mitzvah of going to the temple 3 times a year is learned from the mitzvah of hakel. So I'll just explain. Hakel means the ingathering, like kihila means a community. So hakel is the mitzvah every 7 years, basically on Sukkot, after a Shemitah year, which means this coming Sukkot, in the time when there was a king in Israel. There is a commandment that everyone, and here it is everyone, meaning men, women, children, must come to Jerusalem and hear the king read from the Torah. And it was a time of ingathering. It was a time of unity. It was a time of learning Torah. So since we have this idea of people going to Jerusalem, we have this idea of seeing in both areas, and therefore the Gemara learns details from one to the other. And therefore the Gemara tells us that just like in Hakel, you needed to be able to hear the Torah that was being read, so too when you go to Aliya L'Regel, what we're talking about, 3 times a year, you need to be able to hear, right? And therefore, even though there's no Torah reading at this time, the Gemara parallels the two experiences. And again, the Gemara interestingly says and looks at the verse and says, right, it says you have to hear with your ears. Therefore, if you're deaf in one ear, you are not obligated, right? You have to come with your legs, right? Therefore, if you only have one leg or only one leg is functioning, then you are not obligated. Again, this idea of who is obligated and who is not obligated. The Gemara, since we're talking about going up and footsteps, has a beautiful verse about lovely are the footsteps of the Jewish people when they ascend to Jerusalem, when they do Aliya L'Regel. Just it's important to understand, we keep saying the word Aliyah. It's interesting to note that nowadays when one moves to Israel, it's called making Aliyah, right? This idea that we are going up, whether it's right spiritually, in sanctity. Here as well, when you go to Jerusalem to see the temple, it was called Aliyah, right? You're going up. Again, generally physically, because Jerusalem is on a mountain, but really spiritually. The idea is it's an elevated experience. So that's why it's called Aliya L'Regel, right? L'Regel again here means for the festival, for the regalim. So the Gemara tells us that what does that mean? Lovely are our footsteps, right? It says that we're following in the footsteps of Abraham. Again, right? Abraham is the one who first recognized God, right? Who first ascended this mountain, right? When he went to sacrifice or was willing to sacrifice Yitzchak. That happened on the Temple Mount, on Har HaMoriah, on the site of the temple. So we're following in Abraham's footsteps. Okay. The Gemara continues and talks about that a beautiful idea, since we're talking about the ingathering of the nation. The Gemara tells us that God says to us that when we unite or praise God, then he does the same thing for us. When does this happen? Right? When we say Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, right? The verse that says, right, hear, O Israel, right? Hashem, God is our God, and he is one, right? So when we say that verse, we are unifying God, right? Obviously, God is already one, but we are affirming it. So the Gemara tells us that at the same time, God says to us, right, Mi ka'amcha Yisrael goy echad ba'aretz, meaning who is like the Jewish people who are one nation, right? So this idea that we say that God is one and God says that we are one. So it's a beautiful, I think, parallel. I think also just as a side point, it's interesting, you know, a lot of people talk about prayer, tefillah, is difficult because it seems to be a one-way conversation, right? We say things to God, but you know, I don't hear God responding. I think this Gemara is a beautiful response to that, right? It's saying even though you don't hear it, God is responding to our prayers, right? When we say certain prayers to God, God is also saying almost prayers to us or praise to us. So I thought it was a beautiful idea in terms of prayer and kind of being open to hearing the response. Okay. From here, the Gemara talks about the Torah and how the Torah should be something that leads us on the right path, that it causes us to be fruitful and multiply, that it needs to be learned collectively. Again, the Gemara brings different symbols to remind us of these things, and how we need to acquire Torah. And even though there might be debate and different opinions, right, we have to recognize that it all comes from God, right? This is all from one verse that's learned out in the Gemara. And this another beautiful idea, the Gemara says, right, we have to make our ears like funnels, right? What does that mean? It's like wide on top and narrow at the bottom. So we have to take in as much information as possible, and then we have to have a discerning heart to know what's good for us, right? So kind of like being open to learning Torah is a beautiful idea. There's a very tragic story about a sage that told over some words of Torah without saying it in the right way, and the sage that heard this got so upset that he actually caused the person to become blind. It was a very tragic story. And it seems that Again, here it seems that it is very tragic, and it seems that the law, they were discussing about a law that was actually passed down from Moshe, meaning a tradition that was passed down for many years, and they kind of didn't understand that it was a tradition, and actually took a vote to see what really is the law. But Rabbi Eliezer got upset that they didn't realize that this was actually a tradition that he had all the way back. And then he, when he calmed down, he prayed for Rabbi Yossi's eyesight to come back, and it does come back. So they do live happily ever after, but it's kind of tragic in the middle. Okay, the next topic is, what is a shoteh? How do we define someone who is insane? What does that mean? So the Gemara gives us a kind of like a formula, right? If this person goes out alone at night, if the person sleeps in a cemetery, if the person tears their clothing, those are all seemingly signs of insanity. On Daf 4, the question is this if a person does one of these things, or if the person does all three of these things. The Gemara says, right, again, there's one could explain any one of these things, but if someone does it all together, that must be a sign of insanity, and therefore, again, that person is not obligated to go to Jerusalem. We were talking about someone of undetermined gender is exempt. So too women. Again, women are, we said, as I mentioned, the verse says all males need to go up. And therefore, even though, as I mentioned, women are obligated in Hakel, that was once every 7 years, they are not obligated to go 3 times a year to the temple. Again, I think I think it's understandable. Again, think about how many of us can take a week vacation 3 times a year. I think it's very challenging. So just to understand that the women are not obligated. Again, as I mentioned, right, slaves are exempt because they have to serve their master. We said if you're half slave, half free, you're also exempt. Again, as we said, if you're sick or you're old, all of these people, it's very difficult to get to Jerusalem. If you can't wear, it's important to understand that when you go to the Temple Mount, you cannot wear shoes. It's a sign of disrespect, and therefore you have to be able to walk barefoot. So the Gemara says that if your feet are overly sensitive and you cannot walk barefoot, you also are exempt and you do not need to go up. Again, what if you're blind, as I mentioned, blind in one eye? As I said before, you're exempt because you have to see and be seen, right? God wants, and I think it's, again, a beautiful idea. God wants to see us. And therefore, right, we have to bring the sacrifices. We're sharing, right? We are bringing sacrifices to God, and we're going to basically eat together, right? Have a meal together on this festival. The Gemara now gets into quite a lengthy discussion about different sages who, when they read certain verses in the Tanakh, they would start to cry. And it seems that a lot of these verses talked about God being distant, God judging the Jewish people, and it really struck them, and they became very, very emotional. The Gemara on Daf 4 talks about when Shaul, King Saul, wants an answer about what's going to happen in the future, and he goes to a witch, and they bring back Shmuel, right, Samuel from the dead, right, and it says that Samuel gets upset, right? Why is he upset? And the Gemara tells us he thinks he's being brought to judgment, and he actually brings Moshe with him. That's not in the text, but here, I guess in the Midrash, it says that he brings Moshe with him because he thinks he's being judged, and he thinks, oh, Moshe will be a good he'll be a good witness for me, and he'll stand up for me. And since we're talking about death and coming back from death, we now get into interesting conversations about the angel of death, the Malach HaMavet, right? We have this concept in Judaism that there is a Malach HaMavet, an angel of death that comes and collects souls, presumably in the right time. But interestingly, our Gemara on Daf 4 actually tells us a crazy story about the Malach HaMavet who sends a messenger and he says, I need you to go kill or bring me Miriam, who like raises the children or who takes care of children. But basically, he wants Miriam who braids hair, but this messenger messes it up and brings Miriam who takes care of children. And the Malach HaMavet says, what'd you do? You brought the wrong one. And then the Malach, the messenger's like, I don't know, you told me Miriam and I got confused. And then he says, like, do you want me to send her back? And he says, no. So interestingly, the Gemara here seems to be trying to explain that sometimes people die and it doesn't make sense to us, or it seems unintentional, which is an interesting kind of concept. I think this idea of, you look around and it seems that, people who I don't think anybody deserves death, right? But seemingly unexplained, right? Or people are dying before their times. It seems like the Gemara is trying to explain this in an interesting manner. Daf 5, we'll see, continues on the same genre. We have verses about people who die, again, without justice. They die before their time. And again, it seems that what happens if they die before their time? The Gemara tells us they kind of hang around with the angel of death till it's their time, and then they go up to heaven. And it seems that, if it's, let's say, a mistake, then those number of years that were taken away from them are actually given to Torah scholars. Again, I do not even purport to know what this means. I don't understand it. Again, I think it is sages trying to understand things that many of us struggle with, for the past, I would say, many thousands of years. And I think they're trying to make sense. Someone who I learned with this week, you'll see as we read this daf, we were talking about seeing and being seen, right? The Re'iyah, going to Jerusalem. And now I think we're starting to talk about things that we don't see, right? Things that are hidden, things we don't understand. So the rest of this daf is a little bit like that. The Gemara has a story about a person who is picking figs that weren't ripe. And someone says to him, why are you picking those, pick the good ones? Why are you picking the unripe ones? And he says, well, I'm going on a journey, and if I pick the ripe ones now, then they're going to get spoiled on my journey. So I'd rather pick the unripe ones, and that will help me on my journey. And here again, the Gemara seems to be saying, right, that sometimes the righteous are picked when they're unripe, right, that God picks them early. Again, I think these are difficult concepts that we, need to think about. More verses about sages who are crying when they read them. A lot of the verses are talking about, again, judgment and God sitting in judgment. The Gemara tells us on Daf 5 that if you do something bad and you regret it right away, then God forgives you. And the Gemara talks about if you don't give, that you shouldn't give charity in public, right? Again, we talk about when one gives charity, one should do it privately so as to not embarrass the person. And the Gemara says it's better to not give than to embarrass the person that you're giving it to. The Gemara talks now about the concept of what's called in Hebrew hester panim. which means basically when God hides his face, right? Again, this idea of, remember we talked about God seeing us in Jerusalem. Now we're talking about God not seeing us, right? The Torah tells us that when God doesn't look at us, bad things happen. Right, God hides his face from the Jews, it seems, as a punishment. But the Gemara tells us that don't despair, because really God is still there. Either it's because God is there maybe at, like, during the day he doesn't see us, but at night he does, or this concept of God might not be looking at us, but he has his hand stretched over us, right? The shadow of his hand is still there. So the Gemara now has an interesting interaction. It actually reminds me of a joke. I'm not going to tell it because I'm going to mess it up, but there's a joke about like a Christian and a Jew, and they signal to each other, like one goes like one puts up three fingers and the other puts up one, and I don't remember the rest of it. But there's this joke about signals, and basically the priest is saying, like, they're basically having a whole conversation, but the joke is that each one is saying something, like they think they're having a completely different conversation. I don't know if anybody knows the joke, you can say it, but here it's actually in the Gemara where there's an interaction between Rabbi Yoshua and a heretic, and the heretic basically goes like this, right? He covers his face. Rabbi Yoshua understands that he's trying to say, right, God is not looking at you and punishing you. And then Rabbi Yoshua puts his hand out to say, right, God might not be looking at us, but his hand is always, kind of watching over us. And then the Caesar, who's watching this whole interaction, says to the rabbi, what's going on? And he explains, right, he told me that they're not, that God isn't watching, and I told him that God is watching over us. And then he goes to the heretic, and the heretic says, I told him God isn't watching, but I didn't understand what he said when he put his hand out. And the Caesar says, if you don't understand the conversation, then you don't deserve to be in my palace. And he basically kills him. So it's not a very funny interaction, but interesting that if you're motioning to someone, make sure they understand exactly what you're saying. Again, hidden, understanding, not understanding seems to be the theme on this daf. Another interesting discussion of a student who hid under his rabbi's bed. He wanted to learn how to have relations with his wife, and therefore he thought, what better way could there be than basically listening in on his teacher? Again, he wasn't trying to be inappropriate. He was really trying to learn. We actually did have this story, I think, in Masechet Brachot, but here the teacher finds him and kicks him out, and says, that's not the way to teach, right? You can ask me later. But here they were talking about, can you speak while having relations, right? And it seems that it's better not to, but if you want to appease your wife, then you can speak, and it seems to be an interesting conversation. Okay, from here we get into God crying about the destruction of the temple. The Gemara tells us that God cries 3 times, right, for the first temple, for the second temple, and for when the Jews were set into exile. Again, this idea of God being sad about the destruction of the temple. Interestingly, the Gemara continues and says that God also cries for 3 people. He cries for people who can learn Torah, but they don't. For people who cannot learn Torah, but they do anyway. And he cries for people who are in leadership position, and they lord over their community, right? People who are not good leaders. There's a story about sages who go and visit another sage in another city. It turns out that the sage in the other city is blind, and when they go and visit him, the blind sage gives them a very beautiful blessing, right? So he says, "You honored one who is seen, but who cannot see, right? You can see him, but he cannot see you. May you greet the one who sees but cannot be seen, right? So again, this idea, as I mentioned before, this theme of seeing and not seeing, right? The blind person cannot see, but they could see him and they honored him. May they, right? So the blessing was, may God, who sees everything, but we cannot see him, right? May God bless you. So I thought it's just a beautiful blessing. And again, this idea of a um, of a of a beautiful blessing for one another. The Gemara talks. Okay, and here it's interesting. The Gemara seems to be giving musar. How do you say musar? A value lesson, right? Teaching us a lesson, right? So the Gemara ethics. Thank you. So the Gemara says that if you learn one day a year, if that's all you can do, so then it's as if you learned every day of the year. Right. So if this is your only daf yomi shir for the year, so dayenu, right? Says the Gemara says you do what you can, and they tell a story. The Gemara tells the story of someone who it lived very far from the study hall, and it would take him 3 months to get there. He'd stay there for one day, and then he'd go back 3 months to get home. And they used to make fun of him. You come one day, you think that that's enough. And the rabbi said, "What are you talking about? Look how much effort he puts in to studying Torah. It's as if he studied. The entire year." And the sage then giving, thank you, Zohar says reproof, right? Giving it back a little bit to the students. He says to them, so too with sinning, that if you sin for one day, it could be seen as if you've sinned for a year. And how do we see that? With the spies, the miraglim, right? The spies, they walked, or they spied the land for 40 days, and they were punished for 40 years. How could that be 40 years? They didn't spy for 40 years. One day was like a year. So I think he was telling them, if you guys make fun of this guy one day, you don't just say we made fun of him for one day. That's still, terrible. It's as if you made fun of him the whole year. So kind of take it back. Okay, daf 6. Talk about the minor, right? Are we bringing a child or not? And the Gemara says, again, for Hakel, there's an obligation, again, for that gathering once every 7 years, there's an obligation to bring the children. And the question is, why? Why is there an obligation, right? So it says that, right, the parents have an obligation to bring him because he's learning, right? He's going to just be in the experience. He's going to have that experience. The Gemara says that for Re'iyah, for our topic of going 3 times a year, that the mother does have an obligation to come for Simcha. Again, it says, V'samachta b'chagecha. We need to be happy in our holidays. And therefore, right, part of that is either eating meat or drinking wine. The halacha also says for women it could be getting new clothes. That's where the idea comes of getting something new for the holiday. The idea is that we're supposed to be happy on the holiday. And therefore, and here the Gemara talks about Chana, right? Chana doesn't go to the Mishkan, to the tabernacle, when Shmuel was very young, right? And she said, it says here that maybe it was because he was young, and the Gemara says, no. Shmuel was weak when he was a child, and that's why she didn't bring him 3 times a year. Again, just to remember the story of Hannah when she prays in the Mishkan for a child, right? The idea is that's this Aliya L'Regel. They go every year when it's the festival. They would go to the temple, so it's important to understand the connection. The Gemara says, what if a child is temporarily lame or blind and will be healed by their bar mitzvah, is the child now obligated to go now so that they learn or get accustomed to going? Right? Is it like educational and therefore they are obligated? So the Gemara says that if at this moment if they were an adult in the same situation, they would not be obligated. The same would be true for that child. So if the child is lame, even temporarily, that child does not have to go to Jerusalem. Now we get into a discussion of which sacrifice is more expensive, as we mentioned in the beginning. Beit Shammai says it's the Re'iyah. That should be more expensive. Why? Because that's going all to God. So I should bring the better sacrifice for God, right? That's where I should spend all my money. Beit Hillel say, no, the Chagigah should be more expensive because that's something that, first of all, is shared, right? Meaning God is going to get some and people, and we're going to get some. So it should be more expensive. So there's enough to go around. Or I should say, and Beit Hillel say that this sacrifice, the Chagigah, was brought at Matan Torah, when we got the Torah at Har Sinai, and therefore it shows that this sacrifice is very important, and you should spend more money on it. Beit Shammai say, wait a minute, the Olah, the Riyah, was also brought at Matan Torah, so you can't compare it. And here, because we're talking about what happened at Sinai, right? What happened when the Jews got the Torah? Did they bring, what sacrifices did they bring? And here there's a general conversation about what was taught at Mount Sinai, right? At Har Sinai, did they just learn the general commandments? And then later on, the specifics were taught later on by Moshe, right, in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle? Or no, they got the generals, and they got the specific details at Har Sinai. And of course, it was repeated later on in the desert. From here, the Gemara discusses there's an opinion that the Jews didn't bring the Korban Tamid in the desert, right? Again, we'll see, actually, now we're learning in Parshat Shavua, right? This week, last week, or 2 weeks ago, we talked about the building of the Mishkan, and the priestly garments was last week. This coming week, we're going to discuss the Egel HaZahav, right, the golden calf. But we're going to see afterwards, we're going to learn in Sefer Vayikra about all the sacrifices. And the question was, did they bring those sacrifices in the desert with the Mishkan, or only once they entered Israel and they had a more permanent place? So that is the discussion here on Daf 6. As I mentioned at the beginning in the introduction, the Gemara tells us there are 3 offerings during the festival. Again, the Re'iyah, that's the Olah, the one that's completely for God, the Chagigah, and the Simcha. Right? Again, Chagigah means festive. Simcha means, happiness, joy. And each one, the Gemara tells us, each one of these sacrifices is unique. Right? Again, the Re'iyah is an Olah, meaning it's all for God. That's what's unique about that. The Chagigah was brought before Matan Torah, meaning was before we got the Torah at Mount Sinai. We brought this korban, this sacrifice, and the Simcha, men and women eat from it, as opposed to the other one. So it's interesting how each one of these sacrifices is unique. The Gemara suggests that maybe the daily sacrifice in the desert was done, but it was done differently than the way they did it when they entered Israel. It wasn't skinned and it wasn't cut. This was a concept that was only revealed later on historically. But the Gemara says, and then here this daf finishes discussing what animals were brought at Har Sinai, right, at the giving of the Torah. Was it bulls or also sheep? And here it's a discussion of the verses when discussing the offerings that were brought when the Jews received the Torah. So with that, we finished Daf 6, and Bezrat Hashem, we will continue next week. And I want to wish everyone as we said, a Purim Katan Sameach, and a great week. And looking forward to learning with you next week as well. Have a great week, everyone.
No. Please
you
tell
very
me the
much.
third. What was the third category of the insane?